With that, I'm very pleased to get to the heart of the presentation today, and pleased to introduce David Patterson, a distinguished engineer at Google and a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley. And probably many of you know him as the co-author of one of the most famous computer architecture textbooks of all time, which had made me a huge fan long ago. Super excited to finally really get to meet him and hear him speak and present today. Dave, welcome to the Google Cloud Advanced Computing community.
All right, thanks for inviting me. Nice to meet you wherever you all are. I'll go ahead and present my slides. Okay, as it says in the abstract, this is a tongue-in-cheek kind of talk. My friend and I, when I started my career, we needed to teach graduate students how to give a talk, so we thought it'd be funny to tell them instead how to give a bad talk, and then if you didn't want to give a bad talk, commandments how to give a bad talk, if you didn't want to do it the other way. And then after that one, well, I did how to have a bad career, and then how to do a bad research lab, and this is my latest one, how to give AI a bad carbon footprint. So the format, this lasts about 40-ish minutes, 13 Q&A. So first I'll show you how to do it badly, then if you don't want to do it, and then a lot of fallacies and pitfalls, including one that I saw in the newspaper today, a bonus pitfall or fallacy. Okay, how to do it badly? Well, the advice would be pick the biggest model you can. The OpenAI people said scale gets us more capacity, so we'll take the biggest one. You pick an older GPU, the new ones are expensive and they use more energy, so we'll pick an old one. And then just use the local data center, support your local economy. So that's, if you want to have a bad carbon footprint, that's the advice. So when we started doing this work, we decided it'd be useful to break out the carbon footprint into 4 factors. And each of these factors you multiply together to get the final result. And we use a mnemonic of the 4 M's to help you remember what the 4 factors are. Well, the first one's the model. We're going to pick the Llama open source model, a 405 billion weight model. It takes about 4 septillion floating point operations to calculate it. So that's how much computation we're measuring, the number of operations. The hardware is the machine. Let's pick an older GPU, the V100. That was the first one that had support for machine learning. And it has a rate of how many floating point operations per megawatt hour it can get done. Then we have to put it into a data center. And so we had to kind of stretch to get an M. We call it mechanization of the data center. And one way you measure a data center is there's the energy that goes to the computing equipment. And then there is the energy that's used, that's overhead on top of that. So power distribution uses up electricity, cooling uses up electricity. So how much overhead do you have? And so in a typical local data centers the overhead can be a factor too. So as much energy goes into the goes into the rest of the data centers, it goes to the computers inside the data center, which is, as far as and the last one, and that one's, I think, the thing that was the biggest surprise, which was why where it's located really matters. So in the United States, in the eastern part in Virginia, they have a lot of coal mines. So coal mines are, and coal is of course the dirtiest energy source. So this is per kilowatt hour, how many kilograms of carbon emissions do you produce? So if you make all these bad choices, this turns out to give you a carbon footprint. Oops. The carbon footprint is 240,000 metric tons. Okay, now let's try and not have a bad carbon footprint. How can we improve in those 4 M's? Well, first of all, you want to pick the most efficient model, not the biggest. It turns out the latest GPU or TPU is much more energy efficient than the older ones. The cloud people have been building data centers since for 20 years, and so they know how to build them very efficiently. So use a cloud data center. And the big advantage of the cloud is you get to pick the location. It doesn't have to be where you are. You can do it anywhere in the world, and they're much more efficient places. So these are the things you should do. And so here's our 4 M's. For the model, we're going to pick a gamma, a 27 billion weight model. That's Google's open source model. It's about the same quality as that llama one, but it takes 20 times fewer floating point operations than the 405 billion model. We picked the Trillium. That's the ones we have some results for. It's about 4 times more efficient than the old Volta. Data centers, these days, data centers, cloud data centers are very efficient. They only have like a 10% overhead that goes to power and cooling. So almost, best you could do would be 1.0. It's 1.1. And then if we pick the Northwest, which has lots of hydroelectric power, that's one example of a source of carbon-free energy, and that's about a factor of 10 better. So when you multiply these factors of 10 and 4 and 2 and about 20 together, you get a factor of 1,500. So you could, by being careful, you can reduce your carbon footprint by a factor of 1,500, which is amazing. Okay, so that's kind of the how-to stuff. Now, Jay referred to our textbooks, and at the end of every chapter of textbooks, we have a fallacies and pitfalls section. The idea of fallacies is that it kind of sounds right, but it proves not to be true. And pitfall is a common mistake. You'd think this is the right too, but a common mistake. And then when I was preparing my slides this morning, another kind of misconstruction of what the problem was showed up on my screen. So you get a bonus one at the end here at today. And then we'll do question and answers. First one is use the newest hardware because that's the most carbon efficient. Recently, I and some fellow Googlers published what's called the life cycle analysis of AI hardware, and that's from cradle to grave, getting the materials, making chips, putting them in systems, shipping them, operating them, and then recycling them at the end. And so we looked at 5 different TPUs, typically the inference TPUs, which gets used for serving or called inference, and then the powerful TPUs are the training TPUs. And these things, smaller is better. And there's actually 2 pieces of these bars. The light blue piece is what's called embodied emissions. That's from manufacturing and transportation. So you can see for all the TPUs, the embodied piece or the manufacturing piece is kind of a small piece of it. The other part that's not embodied is called operational. It's how much electricity and emissions do you create when you're operating it. So why are there 2 bars there? Well, as I'll say in a moment, I forgot to say in that last slide, is when I got into this about 5 years ago, a Googler told me, you have to understand, Dave, that energy is physics, but emissions are accounting. And so they have what's called the greenhouse gas protocol, and that's how they kind of set up the rules. Like, okay, who manufactured it, and I bought it. Do I charge me, or do we charge you for it? So they set up all these accounting rules, and identify what's a legal certificate. How do you know that was carbon-free energy? And they have a certificate. So it's a very complicated but accounting system here. So they offer 2 ways to account for operational. One is, let's just say what comes out of the tap from your local utility. How clean is that? Is it hydroelectric or is it coal? And that's the dark blue bar. But they wanted to create a marketplace where people would buy carbon-free energy. And if you allow for that accounting, then the carbon-free energy is this medium colored blue bar. So it's that. So you are buying that dark blue bar of carbon-free energy and getting credit for it. This is for Google. But basically, the newer the machine, whether it's for serving or for trading, it's more efficient than the past one. So, which is a fortunate result. That if we'd done this study and found at the end, well, boy, whatever you do, don't use the latest one, use the oldest one, that certainly would have been disappointing. So we're very happy that happened. The big picture is they use more energy and they do have the manufacturing costs are higher, but they're so much faster, it's more efficient. So that's why it's true. Okay, that's our first fallacy. Now the second one is has to do with this accounting system. And as you might guess from this pictures of the facade, this is a movie set. From the front, it looks great, but when you look behind it, it's just all poles and lumber. There's no building there. So you suspect that this isn't going to work right. So to explain it, I'm going to tell you an allegory. And so I'll go through the allegory and then relate it back to computers and emissions. So the allegory is you and your friend Max are single young guys. You eat all your meals out, 365 days, 3 meals a day. That's almost 1,100 meals. Eat them all out. Well, people are worried about the way you guys are eating, so they offer a organic meal program. And to encourage you to order organic meals, you get a certificate every time you order organic meal. And so you get into it, and they're going to have a contest at the end of the year to see who ate the most organic meals. So you really get into it. You get 900 at the end of the year. You turn in your 900 certificates. You had 900 meals. Your friend Max really didn't care. He ate the way he normally did. At the end of they announce the winners. You win, and you get your name in the newspaper. Your parents and your friends are proud of you. You get more dates. Big success. You loved it. You do it again the following year. And then you realize you got to raise the stakes if you want to win. So you do 1,000, and then they announce the winner, and the winner is your friend Max. And you go to meals with him. He never orders organic. Well, what's going on? And so you confront Max, and he says, well, I read the fine print of the rules, and you get credit for buying meals, but you don't have to eat them. So I found out in San Diego for breakfasts, that's the cheapest organic meal. So I just bought 1,100 organic breakfasts, and I got the certificates and turned them in. But you tell Max, well, that's not the purpose of the contest. It's purpose to eat healthier and to encourage restaurants, local restaurants, to offer organic food 3 meals a day. And you didn't even help, even in San Diego or remote, you only bought breakfasts. So, and he says, well, nevertheless, those are the rules, so I won the contest. So how does this relate to what's going on? Well, the greenhouse gas protocol had offered to make sure you're using really carbon-free energy. They have certificates. They're called energy attribute certificates. And when you use energy, when you buy that and use it, that's called a bundled energy attribute certificate, bundled EAC. But people decided there would be other ways to do it. And they had, well, how about if I buy it some other place, some other time, shouldn't I get credit for it? And these are called unbundled EACs. So when researchers have looked into what's the impact of these unbundled EACs, and this means anytime the same year, anywhere on the same continent, you get credit for it. So kind of like Max, the way Max operated. Well, when they studied it, it didn't really help. Just like Max, he bought stuff in San Diego, and it doesn't really help the local things. So it was criticized for being misleading. So how popular are these unbundled energy attribute certificates? Well, the Financial Times, and most of this data is going to be from 2023 to ground it. It said, well, the majority of the claims of buying carbon-free energy for Amazon, Microsoft were these, kind of not so credible unbundled certificates. I was delighted to see that Google doesn't use it at all, and Facebook hardly uses it at all. Google has had a campaign instead to do what they call 24/7 carbon-free energy, is that every hour of the day, to get credit, you have to be doing every hour of the day, and it has to be local. So that's the only way credit. So that's been our campaign. That's why we didn't use these things. Now, if you look at the total location base where you don't get credit, that's about 40 million metric tons of carbon emissions for data centers in 2023. And if we, the bundled EACs are legitimate. So if we give credit for that, it's about 20 million metric tons. So keep that in mind. Okay. All right. The next one, which is a newspaper time, that's a fallacy, is the data center AI is a major consumer of global electricity. The International Energy Agency, which is an organization about 50 countries that have been around for 50 years, thinks that when they measured it in 2022, it was about 1.2%, and they guess for last year it'd be about 1.5%. Other things are much bigger uses of electricity. Plain old economic growth, electric vehicles, not surprisingly, are bigger growth, and air conditioners are even bigger growth. This is projected by 2030, and then high energy manufacturing. And that's just data centers overall. AI is only a piece of what goes on the data center. When we measured it in Google, between 2019 and 2021, it was between 10 and 15%. It's probably a higher fraction now. Maybe it's a quarter, something like that. So there's, it's not a big, data centers aren't a big global problem. Now, despite they're not big global problem, they can be a local problem. So most countries don't have data centers at all. The concentrated data centers are in the European Union, China, and the US. That's almost, that's 90-some% of the data center. So it's not a global problem, but it can be a local problem if there's a lot in your region. The next fallacy is the United States. There's not much new electricity being made, hardly any. Well, what the insight here is that it's the quality of the availability of electricity. So in kind of computer terms, you'd say how long does your data center stay up? That's referred to as, so often measured as how many nines. So it turns out a goal for many companies is 5 nines, which is about 5 minutes of downtime a year. The electrical grids in the United States typically go for 4 nines, which is less than an hour of downtime a year. That's their kind of customer agreement. So they have a lot of capacity that can't meet that guarantee. So what the opportunity is, and the study that was done at Duke University, they said there's an extra 100 gigawatts per year available if you have a little bit worse quality, like 99% rather than 4 nines. And so what this means, and apparently Google is doing this, they'll go to a utility, say, we'll take your lesser quality or lesser available electricity, and we'll use batteries. And you don't need to make any investments. We'll just use your spare electricity that you're not selling right now, and we'll be happily to use that. So it actually, that effect is if you build a data center that uses lower quality electricity or lower availability electricity, without any investment, the utilities get more money, so that actually could lower your electricity bill. Next one is this renewable stuff is just too expensive. So remarkably, solar is the lowest cost supplier of electricity, and it's also very clean in terms of the carbon footprint. You can see coal is the worst in terms of carbon footprint, and it's even more expensive than solar. Natural gas is not as good there, and it's getting more expensive over time. So surprisingly, renewable energy can be very inexpensive as well as relatively expensive as well as being low carbon footprint. Another thing that you hear about, was in the paper, that single dealing with a chatbot can drinks as much as a bottle of water, or 10 things can be bottled water. So when we looked into that, this was, and here in California at a University of California Riverside campus, they said per prompt, it can use as much as almost 50 milliliters of water. So let's drill down on that one. Well, the 50 milliliters of water was in the state of Washington, northwest of the United States, which has this hydroelectric power. So why is that a problem? Well, 90%, because it wasn't the cooling of the data centers, it was the generation of electricity that they thought they should charge. And if you use hydroelectric power, they kind of allocate a lot of water evaporation to that. And it's because it's a reservoir, it's an open reservoir, and it evaporates. Now, charging electricity for the water evaporation is kind of silly, because the reason for reservoirs isn't to make electricity. They don't dam rivers to do that. They dam the rivers to be a supply of water for agriculture or for the population. Now, in the United States, only about 3% of all reservoirs have electricity. So to pretend that they build a dam to generate electricity and you should charge it for the water evaporation is pretty misleading. So we calculated for a Gemini model, typically it uses a quarter of a milliliter, that's 5 drops of water. And if you want to charge it for the electricity, which I don't know if that's a good idea, but it'd kind of double that, so it's 10 drops of water. But basically, our measurements are that it's a factor of 150 less than this for our things. And then the kind of the assumption is if you have a data center, it's got to consume water. That's not the case. There's many ways to do it, and Google uses all. One way is you can be waterless. You can just use giant air conditioning units. It uses more electricity. That overhead that I talked about, instead of 10% overhead, it's like 20 or 25% overhead. So you trade off a greater electricity use for less water use. You can also, in colder regions, you can just bring in cold air or cold seawater to cool it. Google does all these things. And you can use the evaporative coolants like you see there, where you do use water. And so you try and pick what works best for the geography. There are places that have plenty of water and places that are high stress, so you don't want to use evaporative there. And Google has had this program for a while. They're trying to, there's other places where you can reclaim fresh water, so the goal is 120%, so that by 2030, Google will create more fresh water than it uses. That's the goal. And to keep things in perspective, which is hard to do in this, how much is 100 megawatt data center, which is a pretty big data center? How much water is used? It's about as much as a golf course. We have like 500 or so of these campuses that are data centers, and we have 16,000 golf courses in the United States. And then this book that came out is a New York Times bestseller book, and it made pretty strong claims about water use compared to a town in South America. And this high school physics teacher, Andy Masley, took a look at some of the numbers, and it just didn't seem plausible. I mean, the claims were so much that was enough water for people. Well, he looked into it and found there was a unit conversion error. The author thought it was milliliters, but it was actually cubic meters, so 1,000 times bigger. So he raised it, and the author said, "Oh, you're right. My book is off by a factor of 1,000." So it's, so the next print is been for sale 6 or 9 months. So a future printing of the book will make this little tiny factor of 1,000 correction to it. But, this adds to people's concerns about data center. The next one is that edge. When we did this stuff about data centers, people said, what about the edge? What about phones, the carbon footprint of that? So we did a study of that. So it turns out for phones, most of the use of phones is for the display, right? The display and the wireless radio to do communication. And then a thing that most people ignored was chargers, which we factored it. So, but the actual AI piece is pretty small for phones. And what we learned is that the wireless chargers are tremendously less energy efficient than wired chargers. In fact, my wife got rid of all our wireless chargers after we learned that. And a lot of people just leave their chargers plugged in, and there's this thing, these things use power when they're not plugged in, particularly wireless chargers are ready at any instant. You drop a phone on it, they're always using electricity. That's called vampire electricity use.
What is the carbon footprint of machine learning on our smartphones? The good news is that for all of the phones in the world, machine learning adds up to only about 0.3 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per year. Pretty small compared to the amount Wi-Fi and the display add. When we add in all the other processes on the phone, we're just over 10 million tons of CO2. Of course, the phones are running on battery power and only drawing electricity from the grid when charging. Wireless chargers are increasingly popular, but unfortunately, they are even less efficient. If we forget to unplug our wireless chargers, they continue to draw power from the grid, like energy vampires, even when nothing is charging. If manufacturers included a sensor that only activated the charger when a phone was present, we could save most of this wasted energy. So is that all? Well, no. Unfortunately, all of this pales in comparison to the emissions created through the process of manufacturing the phone itself. It brings us up to over 100 million tons of CO2 per year for the world's smartphones. So clearly, we have a lot of opportunities to reduce our smartphones' impact on the environment.
So let's remember that number for the next slide. Whoops. Okay. The next fallacy is AI is the biggest environmental problem in information technology. So this is what kind of got me into this. An article that said training a model, this was 5 years ago or 6 years ago, 2019, this was a relatively small model in 2018. It said it used as much emissions as 5 car lifetimes. And then that was trumped by a article that was in the flagship publication of IEEE, a professional organization for electrical engineers. The training a model 3 years later in 2024 would cost $100 billion. So this was 2 years, $100 billion, and produce as much emissions in New York. And that was topped by people who said, well, 2 years after that, it would cost $20 trillion, bigger than the gross domestic product of the United States. So, when I started seeing these claims, I asked my friends in machine learning, is this true? And they didn't think so, but they didn't have any data. So that one of my hobbies became to try and figure this out. So I'll tell you what we learned. So training, the two pieces of machine learning are training and inference. Training is like sending your kid to college, and inference is like the kid graduates and using the knowledge in a job. So that's training and inference. So training is much more intensive, but many more people use inference. So Google published a paper about one of their models. Probably the most famous model of all time was Transformer. This is the basis, the T in GPT is Transformer. So it's kind of the excitement in the last 5 or so years around AI is a lot of it has to do with Transformer models. So they decided, this research group decided, let's try and make a more efficient version of Transformer. They called it Evolve Transformer. So the technical name for what they're doing is called a neural architecture search. So these things are called deep neural networks or neural models. That's the kind of AI that's popular today. So the goal was to make it cheaper and use less energy and less carbon footprint to train a new model. And the idea is once you create one of these models, it gets used over and over again. It's not like every time you do it, you create a new model. You use one model and they put it on GitHub and people use thousands of times or tens of thousands of times. And so they published a paper, hey, we found this more efficient model that can do Transformer equally well, but it'll save you money and electricity and emissions. But they didn't include any numbers. So, people even in 2018 were worried about the carbon emissions of AI, and I think rightly so. So at the University of Massachusetts, a group did a study about the search for a better model, trying to evaluate the carbon emissions. Unfortunately, there's some flaws in the paper. The first is they didn't get the 4Ms right. They didn't ask Google for what are the 4Ms. They just kind of did it on their own. They used local data centers and older GPUs, and they didn't use exactly. They did things differently because about this search. So their answer was a factor of 5 too high because they didn't have the right 4Ms, but that's kind of understandable. Unfortunately, what they didn't understand is part of the search of the space, you have a model that you're exploring the space to see if it does it work better or not. What they didn't realize, Google used a simplified version of that model to search the space, so it'd be faster and cheaper, and they could explore more of the space. So they didn't factor that in. So besides the factor of 5 for the wrong 4Ms, there's another factor of 19 because they didn't understand in the search system. So that's a factor of 88 too high. But that's not the worst mistake. The worst mistake is many people, even most people, and those headline writers, didn't understand that the UMass study was about evaluating the environmental impact of the search for the model. They thought it was training the model. They thought that's what they thought it was. So that led to that another factor of 1,300 increase in the size, which also made it newsworthy, which is what, when you multiply that out together, it was 120,000 times bigger than it really was. And when you multiply a result by 120,000, it's much bigger. This is where the 5-car lifetimes came from. And so it was news. So it got a lot of coverage because people were surprised it was that big. So instead of like 250,000 kilograms for training that model, it was actually 2.4 kilograms. So hardly any less. Now, what do? This paper appeared in a conference. You can't really write a letter to the editor about the conference. So I thought what we do is we write a paper. And the paper, that's the paper we wrote. We came out a couple of years afterwards. And, it's increasing over time. But the paper with the flaw is, it's up and to the right. It's the number of citations is going even much greater. So we're not even closing the gap. So once somebody makes a mistake like that and puts it out there, it's very hard to correct it. And we need to get the numbers right to make sure we're working on the most important problem here. So what is the biggest problem in AI? So here's that 18.6. We got that earlier slide. That's after giving credit for bundled energy certificates, but not the unbundled ones. It's about 20 million metric tons per year for data centers in 2023. The phone one from the prior slide was 72 in 2023. Kind of an easy way to think about it, if you want to use the back of the head, last year it was about 1.25 billion phones, and making a phone is about 60 kilograms. So you multiply them together, that's about 80 million metric tons. Now, the operational piece, there's the embodied and the operational. Phones are very energy efficient, so they don't use that much. Data centers, most of it is operational. It's not the embodied. We showed you that before. And remember, only a fraction of what's in data centers is for AI. Let's say it was a quarter. So the biggest problem facing AI, facing IT today, is the cell phones we use. We make a billion a quarter cell phones every year. We discard them every 2 or 3 years. In 2023 is probably a factor of 15 bigger. We made data centers getting more popular. Maybe it's closing the gap. It's going to take a while before data centers and AI are equal to the environmental impact of phones. But it's kind of easier to attack data centers, things that you don't think you're directly using, as opposed to take responsibility for the fact that you're buying phones every couple of years and we're collectively adding a lot of to the environment. The next one is ignoring the upsides of AI. Another one of my hobbies is we did a paper recently that just came out where we looked about how researchers can help shape the impact of AI. And one of the things we said, there's upsides and downsides to AI. We hope researchers can do things that'll improve the upsides and minimize the downsides. But it's silly to ignore the upsides as it's silly to ignore the downsides. So one of the upsides of AI is it may come up with some great ideas that could improve the carbon footprint. My favorite one is this work done on contrails. So aviation is a very large fraction of global emissions, much larger than data centers. But turns out that when airplanes fly, that they create contrails, and contrails are significant in their carbon footprint. And it only happens when airplanes fly through humid regions. So AI can predict what's the best path for planes to fly to reduce the contrails. So Google, in partnership with American Airlines, did 70 test flights over 6 months. And to avoid the contrails, they had to fly a little higher, a little lower, or avoid things. So it used 0.3% more fuel, which is, that increases the carbon emissions and the cost. But they can reduce contrails by 62%, which is amazing. So in terms of and using published sources here, aviation in 2018 was about, a billion tons of CO2, 1,000 million tons of carbon emissions, under the assumption that we look over 100 years. So how much warming happens from carbon emissions over 100 years, which is a typical number. So we could save about 400 million tons. Now it's hard. There's error bars on that. It's probably at least 200 million. It might be as much as 900, but let's say it's 400 million tons that you can save that. So if the greenhouse gas protocol approved it, and if 100% of airlines started using AI to reduce their contrails, the impact, how is the impact? That's like 20 times bigger than all the hyperscale usage. It was about 20 million metric tons in 2023. That's 20 times higher. It's, there's a range there. It's about 70 times higher than AI use. And then it's 5 times bigger than the phone. So this single AI-derived emissions. If it becomes widely embraced, it could have a bigger carbon, it could, offset all of the things. Now, it's not like we should subtract that. It's just that there'll be upsides of AI, and that can help as well. That could even be bigger help than what's going on in the data centers, as far as I see. Okay, and the last one is from today's news. I just learned about it today. Scientists have found alarming environmental impact of vast data centers. Data centers can warm up the surrounding areas by 9 degrees. 9 degrees, actually 9 degrees centigrade. I thought it was Fahrenheit. Okay, so what's going on here? This is the paper. It appeared in Archive. For those of you who aren't scientists and engineers, this is not a refereed publication. Anybody can put a paper in there. So no, there's no filter. So you put it out there, and you better be right, because there's nobody checking your numbers. And this is a large set of authors. One of the persons at Cambridge University, he's an electrical engineer at Cambridge, and he's the first author. And so what they asked is whether is data centers warming the land around them. Now, a lot of probably people think when they heard 9 degrees, they thought it was air temperature, but they're actually doing the land. And so if you remember Andy Masley, he's the high school physics teacher who found the factor of 1,000 mistake in the Empire of AI book. Well, he took these results and just, yesterday found out this is bogus. And his first quote is, the authors vaguely attribute this temperature change to data center heat waste. So you remember the evaporative cooling the data centers come in. But it's almost certain to entirely due to the fact that the surface of any building, a data center or a Walmart or a Starbucks, is hotter than grass. So if you replace grass with a building and you measure, it's hotter because it's reflecting, it gets hot heat in the sun that the grass doesn't. And the authors claim in this unrefereed paper that we should build more efficient algorithms, but the actual conclusion, Andy says, is don't build buildings if you don't want buildings to get warm, even though it doesn't affect anything around them. And he looked and he did his high school, he can use high school physics to calculate for a 100 megawatt data center, at most 1 or 3% of the ground temperature would be attributed to the exhaust there. So he thinks really if they had done a controlled study, if they'd built like a Walmart, in a remote place and built roads and everything to Walmart and talked about the heat, it would be very similar to whether you did with a Walmart or the data center. So they should have done that in the control there. But nevertheless, it makes, it's kind of, wow, I didn't know that. This is another negative thing about data centers, that they consume vast amount of water. They have heat impact, and they raise electricity prices. So it adds to it. So wrapping up, before questions, just almost exactly when I said, it's, there are these 4 M's to keep in mind. If you want to try and improve your AI, try and use the most efficient model, try and use the latest hardware, use it in data centers because they have very, cloud data centers, and cloud data centers let you pick where you want to compute. And so pick a location that uses carbon-free energy. We can use the power of the pocketbook to encourage companies to build in regions that have lots of carbon-free energy. We shouldn't use these misleading unbundled energy attribute certificates. I believe the Greenhouse Gas Protocol group is going to get rid of those in the next release, but we should stop using them. For computer people like me, we want to worry about performance per watt and performance per kilowatt hour, not just performance per dollar. And we need to get the numbers right to make sure we're working on those problems. At the end of one of these papers, when I realized it was off by 100,000, I was like, why am I working on data center stuff when the biggest problem is the phones? And because if we multiply the data stuff by 100,000, it would be the biggest problem. But, we criticize various politicians for ignoring relatively obvious science of the numbers about global climate change. We got to, I think that's a good policy. I think we need to hold that for everybody to make sure we're doing it. So I am working on projects to try and do what we can to stretch the lifetime of phones, because I think that's where our big problem is, bigger than AI. AI is growing rapidly. It may get there. I don't know how many years, but our reason we ground it in a given year, so we have reality, and then it's hard to know what's going to happen in the future. If there could be some kind of correction, and maybe this growth won't happen. It may happen. Okay, with that, I am ready for questions, Jay.
All right. Thank you. Let's everybody give a round of applause to Dave for that awesome presentation. Dave, I have a feeling this is going to be cited by a lot of the attendees here, and our YouTube hits are going to go through the roof for this. It was certainly very enlightening, and I really appreciated you correcting a lot of the myths and fallacies that we all read every day. I can think personally of several people in my life who know I work at Google who bring these kinds of things up, and I'm just going to send them this link now. So thank you very much for that. We'll take some questions now out of the Q&A channel. Let me pull these up, and there's still time to submit questions if you want. And first question, my buddy Raghu. David Patterson, huge fan of your work. Is the transformer architecture with self-attention being stretched beyond its capabilities for AI? Needs training with trillions of parameters and inferencing with prefill, compute heavy, and decode, memory intensive phases. The transformer architecture, December 27th, Google paper, and then it cut off. But I think what Raghu's getting at here, Dave, is despite correcting these myths and fallacies, it's still a energy intensive methodology compared to something like active inference AI, which is based on free energy principle, real-time dynamic learning at the edge and whatnot. What is your feeling about the transformer method and the relative compute intensity of it? Do you think that we're at a ceiling there with where we can go with it, and we should start looking at other algorithms, or do you think?
Well, people are. I mean, I gave you the evolved transformer was an example of a more efficient algorithm. I think ever since transformer came out, people have been figuring out ways to make it more efficient. And as you know, I'm not an AI expert, but I work with some. And they said, if you look at the original transformer paper from 2017 versus what we're doing today, they're only loosely related. I'll throw out some buzzwords, but if you don't know the buzzwords, it's okay. We use mixture of experts now, which is a sparser. It's sparser rather than a dense approach, and that reduces the energy costs and carbon footprint. We have multi-headed attention. There's, it's kind of, you could see that it kind of evolved from the transformer, but it's very different from what it is today. But transformer has had this kind of surprising effect that you can just pour more, the scaling thing that the OpenAI people noticed. The more parameters, the more compute you put into it, the better it gets. But people are very highly motivated to come up with more efficient algorithms or more efficient versions. I mean, when we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars invested, there's all kinds of ideas that are going on to reduce the cost. And it's good that you kept in track the training versus inference. If we can do inference on phones, that'll be dramatically, phones that will have a limited amount. Phones that aren't going to burn a lot more power, otherwise it'll, set your pocket on fire. So if inference ends up being largely on phones, that'll have a huge savings going ahead. We're in this space race to be all these companies, all these countries, to be the first to get, really smart AI. I've never seen anything like it. The space, for those of you who aren't old enough, when the race to the moon, it wasn't clear who was going to get there first, right? But it was kind of ego, which country could get to the moon. This could be opening up scientific discoveries. It could be saving or great sums of money. So we don't really know. So it's just an amazing investment that's going on. It's not so much, I don't think of it as so much as it's transformers' fault as it is this race that's happening. And it's simultaneously a scientific race. If you really get the first intelligent AI, really smarter, superhuman, that's kind of a Nobel Prize quality result, and simultaneously with that, huge financial impact. So it's a very, an interesting, usual time.
And Dave, I really like the example you gave of the contrails there, where the AI usage can have a dramatic effect in reduction of carbon emissions. And I liken that, as a specific example of Google DeepMind's overall vision, solve AGI and then use AGI to solve everything else. So in the end, this can all be worth it if it helps us solve all of these problems as opposed to creating them. And I like the fact that you address the fallacies about these problems being made to sound more severe than they are, sometimes through numerical errors, sometimes through not accounting for certain variables, et cetera. But the positive scientific spin on that is you can also solve a lot of these problems potentially in collaboration with AI.
The AGI stands for artificial general intelligence. And, even if we don't get there, this is very useful stuff right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible in 5 or 10 years, like whatever happened to AGI, right? Even if that happens, the stuff is very useful, even if it doesn't reach these lofty goals. And it could help with a lot of problems falling short even if we don't get to AGI. So yeah, it's a very interesting, exciting time.
Dave, I got a question from Cons October here. Cons asks, he says, I am Cons. Thank you for the super discourse, David. Is there a business case for edge data centers powered only by renewable energy? How does one validate the hypothesis and build a product/service?
Yeah, well, what's happening certainly in the United States, where the United States doesn't have plant, it's been shrinking electricity use has been the plan. So can't easily expand a lot. So you just building a building and go to utility and say, I need 100 megawatts is not good. In fact, I understand there's a data center that somebody speculatively built in Silicon Valley, that they built the data center and they can't get any electricity for it. So the companies are going to go off grid to build data centers. They're going to get their own. And, solar Google is already starting to do solar with batteries, car battery technology to give that. And training, remember the training is like sending your kid to college. You don't have to train 24/7, right? If you had to take some time off, that's not a disaster.
Yeah.
So some of the data center stuff is for training, and training has this kind of flexibility to it. And so certainly Google isn't the only company that's looking at doing training off the grid in places where if they have to use battery power part of the time, it will still make sense. Yeah, they're doing it because of the space race. They're investing these billions of dollars. They're doing things. There's a lot of money there. So they're not really trying to, hey, I'll stick a data center in this neighborhood and force all the local residents to pay to bring my electricity costs down. That's not neighborly, and it's not even good business. And plus their goals are so big, just plopping a data center in a neighborhood they can't get there. So they're going to be going off grid for sure.
Yeah, Dave, I have a little anecdote on that myself. Here in Texas, we have a tremendous amount of wind power.
Yeah.
And wind power, of course, is more available at night. Solar during day, obviously. Wind generally more at night. And I was talking to a data center company, and I won't say any names or anything, and they were wanting to pursue this very different workload. And I said, I don't know why you're pursuing that workload. I think this AI thing is going to be huge, and you've got a variable source of power that you're worried about all your natural gas backup for. But for training models, this is perfect. You've got this one. In fact, they sometimes pay them for energy usage to modulate certain things on the West Texas power grid. And I was very pleased to see a year later they'd signed a massive contract for wind power for AI training models and everything.
Yeah, I had to appreciate that. Oklahoma and Texas are prime in the United States, are prime categories because they're these big wide open things with a lot of wind. And wind blows. Sun is on. There's no sun at nighttime, but there's wind at night. So it's a popular place.
They have a natural tendency to balance each other throughout the day, which means the amount of actual balancing from natural gas fired things is generally a lower need. Okay, we have another question here. Guillaume Tessera, Guillaume, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, says, curious if you have considered the rebound effect of a lot of the optimizations and performance you were highlighting. Newer generations and releases will be more optimized for energy consumption and CO2 emissions, but also offer more availability for computation, create more demand, etc. Not quite sure.
Yeah, there's a thing called Jevons paradox, which people think is a law. It's an observation that sometimes when you make something cheaper, people buy more of it, right? And so what the argument is, well, even if you make things more efficient, it's a net loss because people will buy it more. So that's not like a requirement. It's not like it has to happen, but it can happen. What's happening right now, it isn't that, I don't think. I think, there's no cap on intelligence. Is if we use IQ points. Hey, I can do an AI that has 150 IQ. You know what? That's all I need. I am not interested in anything any smarter than that. I don't think we think that. I think, oh, could you do 180? Could you do 200? So I think there's this drive to see how far we can go. And there's hopefully Google and these other companies have a business model how to take advantage of that. But it's almost as if it's the scientific pursuit. How smart can we make it? And that's really driving it. And now, given we're going to do that, let's try and do it the most energy efficient and economically beneficial way we can. But it's not just like, my AI colleagues, you made it cheaper. It's half the cost. I'll double. They would make it a factor of 10 tomorrow if they could. They're insatiable. So this insatiable demand isn't so much enabled by the improved hardware as it is that they have the insatiable demand. And let's try and, if we don't do it carefully, it'll be even worse. It'd be kind of my take on it.
Thanks. We do have one more question, but we have some final slides that I need to present. So I'm going to ask Mary to pull those slides up. I'll ask the final question, and we can answer this one pretty quickly, I think. I have a doctor's degree and feel I could fall for those bogus claims with 1000x errors. What can people in the media and the general public do to spot a deeply flawed publication and claim there? I'm going to answer first, Samuel. I'm going to say have presenters like David Patterson present the actual facts, and you can share this YouTube video with people after this when we get it posted later this week. And please share this widely because there's not enough conversations like this.
Yeah, I think part of it is understandably, I like to believe that people know me, that I speak the truth, whether anybody independent who signs my paycheck, but people are naturally suspicious of that. So it was interesting to me that high school physics teacher is having huge impact because people are pretty sure he doesn't have any axe to grind, and his name's Andy Mesley. And so he's pointed out the water fallacy and this new heat fallacy, and he kind of rips it to shreds. So you could find, he's got a Substack, if you know what that is. So you could follow Andy. I would say, if you're a researcher, I learned this early in my career. If you have a result that's from industry and it might be critical, share it with them before you publish. And I think it's even like, polite behavior. Before you criticize somebody, you might want to share it with people to get their feedback in case you got something wrong. And then you'll have an even stronger case if you do. So the examples I cited, every single case, had they gone to the people and explained what they thought was going on, like that UMass study, we would have made some corrections there. And then when the result came out, we go to reporters, no, it's not training a model, or the water result. We could have corrected it there, and then you wouldn't be, you can get a lot of publicity by making false statements. I would feel guilty about it if I did it, but I think you could avoid these problems if we just checked before we published.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Let's give Dave another round of applause. Thank you for presenting to us today.